Hi, and welcome to episode 66 on Middle Eastern Islamic history. Today, we're going to be talking about Palestinian history, and here are the rules for those of you who are unfamiliar. This is not an academic presentation. I am not accredited in history, religion, philosophy, or any of the subjects that we will be discussing tonight. That said, I am a lawyer, and I do have to talk about law. I can't imagine how anybody would give a presentation about Palestinians and not talk about law. But this is not legal advice. I am not your attorney. There's no attorney-client privilege that's created by the dissemination of this information, nor should this be taken as a legal understanding that can apply to a day-to-day life in the perspective of an actual person, because laws have a lot of bureaucratic laws that this will not cover. All right, I'm going to try and address this from a secular perspective, meaning that I'm not going to try and weight one side or the other, try to address it from a neutral historical perspective. And in that vein, I'd like to be respectful, and I hope that everybody here can be respectful. That said, I love interactivity. Questions, comments, clarifications, please put those in the chat. I do read the chat and will respond in real time. There will also be a Q&A after 2 hours where we can address any additional questions. What I like to say is that these presentations are a 101 and a 201. 101 meaning if you don't know anything, I'll give you enough details for you to have a sort of sense of what happened, and a 201 meaning that if you already know something about the region, already are familiar with some of the details, I'll probably still tell you things that you didn't know. I also have what I call a 2-hour hard stop, which means that after 2 hours, if I haven't gotten through all my slides, and that is quite likely, I will stop there and we'll do our question and answer section. And whatever I don't cover tonight, that's okay. I'll just cover it next Wednesday. And when I put the dates below a person, if they're a political figure, those will be the dates of their service, be it as a general or as a minister or as a president. And when we're talking about a thought leader, those will be the dates of their life. And you can generally figure out which one is which, because if it's an old man and he has 3 years of life, that's probably his years of service. That said, this will be a recording. You can watch it later. You can watch all the 65 previous episodes and the other things that we do in our group, History Mostly Ancient Discussions, and you can find them on our YouTube channel there. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel if you want to see more of this kind of programming. And if you want to be able to see all of our events from not just my series, but other series, please join our meetup group in order to find out when our upcoming meetings are. And if you like what you see, because premium Zoom, premium meetup, premium YouTube, these all cost some money, please, we appreciate donations, and you can send them to those 2 addresses. All right, so let's start with sort of the discussion of what is a Palestinian, because that is, a very difficult question that we have to answer in order for this to make sense. And there are a few serious points that I want to bring up. The first one is that we have a sort of idea that sits in our mind uncritically, which is the idea that if you have a piece of land and there are a group of people who are living on that land, then those people have some kind of identity. Now, one particular piece of land that I wanted to choose to show how this idea doesn't necessarily bear fruit is the idea of Westchesterian, right? You can see on the map of New York, I've shaded the county of Westchester in red. That's a clearly defined piece of land. There are people who have lived there for over 100 years, them and their ancestors. They certainly have certain behaviors in terms of their political affiliations, in terms of their value on education, the diversity of various communities, so forth and so on. They have certain rituals in terms of how they greet each other. But I don't think anybody would say that there is such a thing as a Westchesterian, that they have an ethnic will, right? That they have some sort of national consciousness, that they have political aspirations as Westchesterians, that if they were spurned by, the neighborhood Putnamians or Orange Countyers, that suddenly that there would be some sort of result. So we should be clear that just having a piece of land with borders doesn't create an ethnic identity. Now, I don't think Westchesterian is necessarily the right view for Palestinian, but we're going to have to sort of figure out where it is between something that is like Westchestrian, where it is simply a marker of people from a certain piece of territory and how accurate that could be, and something where it is today, where it is clearly a cognizable ethnic identity. So if we look at the language dialects on the left-hand map, you can see that there is that these dialects, number one, overlap quite significantly. There are some areas, for example, Nazareth, you can see it's on the border of sort of Palestinian dialect and Central Levantine dialect, as those terms are being coined. But what you can very clearly see is that these dialectical differences don't follow the geopolitical borders that exist. That those geopolitical borders that exist are an artifact of the 20th century, and that these dialects are much older in terms of how they came to be, right? These are dialects of the Arabic language. And so it's not necessarily the case that language here is doing the entire legwork on creating identity. But I want to also point out that these dialects, these Levantine Arab dialects, these Shami dialects, are fundamentally different than the dialects in Egypt, the dialects in Mesopotamia, and the dialects further east and southeast in Arabia. And of course, north of them is Turkey, where they don't speak Arabic at all. And this difference is something that you can find if you actually look at the ledgers from Egypt, right? Because Egypt has immigration ledgers that date from the dynasty of Muhammad Ali, which we covered in episode 30. If you go to the ledgers of immigration, they will say the town that the person came from, and they will identify them ethnically or in terms of origin as Shami, as Levantine. So there's definitely an idea of a Levantine identity that exists at least as far back as the 19th century. Whether or not that is a Palestinian identity is something that may well develop over time. There's another piece that I want to tease out of this as well. And this is the idea that the term Palestinian refers to the indigenous population of what the British controlled as the former Mandate of Palestine. We know, however, that there are some groups that don't fit this definition. For example, the Old Yishuv, that is Jews who were living in the territory prior to the Zionist movement. The Druze population, which is an ethno-religion that deviated somehow from Shiite Islam. It's a post-Islamic religion. And the Bedouin, who are the nomadic Arabs, primarily in the Negev desert. These groups are all indigenous to this region, the former British Mandate of Palestine, but are not covered by this term Palestinian. So what is it that people are talking about when they're talking about Palestinian? Because simply coming from the land is insufficient for the definition. And we have to go back to the history of how this region was organized. This region was organized primarily with large-scale landlords, and those landlords would own, almost in a feudalistic style, a significant piece of territory, and on that territory there would be sharecroppers or serfs. Now, in Arabic, there was never this delineation of feudalism in the same way with its specific nomenclature that existed in Europe. And so the people who worked the land were called felah, or peasants, as just a general term. Or felahin. And you can see these sort of workers of the land, even in modern day Arab countries, primarily in the agricultural sector. So it's worth pointing out that the three populations that I just described, the Old Yishuv, the Druze, and the Bedouin, were for various different reasons not part of the felah. The Jews were not part of the felah because they were primarily in cities, and therefore were not working in agricultural areas. The Druze were not working there because they, in many cases, were the landlords. Them or Turkish individuals from Constantinople. And the Bedouin were not working the land because they were nomadic, right? They were living in a completely different style of existence. So there's the question of were there warlords. We're actually going to discuss how there were different individuals at different points in the history of this region that had more autonomy or less autonomy as time moved on. And some of those who had more autonomy could be considered warlords in that they declared war and they were lords over land. But I think that we could use a more neutral term like a prince or a noble to describe what they were, than necessarily this sort of idea of somebody who just runs around on a horseback shooting people, because I don't think that that's really accurate. And there's another thing that's worth pointing out when it comes to indigeneity here. And this is one of the things that shows that there's a degree of commingling and a degree of non-clarity when it comes to what a Palestinian is. If you look at those circles, inside the blue circle is where you see the majority of Jewish populations, both Sephardic and Mizrahi Jewish populations. Inside the red circle is where you generally see Palestinians, Jordanians, and Syrians all clumping together. And in the green is where you see populations from Arabia. So we're going to see that there's a certain degree to which Palestinians are genetically Levantine, and you can see sort of shaded in pink is the entirety of the Levant region. And they are, to a certain degree, the descendants of Arabian admixture, right? There's some degree of foreign invasion, perhaps during the initial conquest of Islam to the region, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. But generally speaking, they fit within this bandwidth for what a Levantine person is. And we would expect to see some differentiation. You can see a lot of different colors in that pink shaded region. This was particularly done to see the distinctions between Lebanese Muslims, Christians, and Druze. So those sort of stand out more. But you can see that over the course of the Levant, you have a consanguinity between these populations that are relatively close. We also should take a second to disambiguate the term Palestinian, because just because a term exists for a piece of territory doesn't mean that the people on that territory will use it to refer to themselves. And I put the example here of the Palestine Post. The Palestine Post was a Jewish-run newspaper. It was run by the New Yishuv, that is to say the Zionist immigrants who came in the beginning of the 20th century, the 1920s, and so on. And this was their newspaper, right? They used the term Palestine because that was the name of the British-controlled territory at the time, and that's how they labeled themselves. And all of the citizens, and we're going to talk about this in literally a few minutes, of that territory were Palestinians. So that referred to the old Yishuv, the Jews who had been there indigenously, the new Yishuv, the Jews who had immigrated in the 1920s, and it referred to other indigenous populations, the Christians, the Muslims, the Arabs who are not Christian or Muslim, Circassians, and so on. So the term only became used as a representation of the Falah, of the former British Mandate of Palestine, in the post-independence period. And in fact, most of the organizations that we're going to see that were, we can call them anachronistically Palestinian organizations, didn't use the word Palestinian in their name at all, because Palestinians, as we use that term now, didn't call themselves, generally speaking, Palestinians back then. And so we're going to have to trace a lot of different names that people are going to use for each other, like Arabs, like Turks, like Levantines, throughout this period to understand who we're talking about. And of course, the last important point is that Palestinian identity has something to do with the experience of Zionism, of the experience that these were individuals who, due to the Jewish development and Jewish nationalism in the region, have lost or believe that they have lost something integral to their person. So that experience is an experience that wasn't felt by any other Middle Eastern population to the same degree, although we could easily say that the Jewish populations that were deported from their home countries in the Middle East, that the Assyrians who are which is a Christian religious minority, an ethnic minority in northern Iraq, Syria, Turkey, and Iran, have suffered similarly. The Kurds have been expelled to a certain degree from their homelands, and so on and so on. Similar to those populations, the Palestinians have a sense that they have lost something fundamental about their homeland because of Zionism, because of the process of Zionism, and that's something that no other Arab population, generally speaking, feels. All right, and so if we talk about Palestinian culture, in many ways it is very similar to a lot of the culture that we've seen from other Arab countries, but I just want to point a few things out. The first one is that that their music and their dance styles tend to differentiate village by village, town by town. This is not unique for the Levant. Most Levantine countries have a distinct style of dress, a distinct style of dance. Debka, for example, exists throughout the Levant, and Palestinians are known for it, but so are Lebanese and Syrians and Jordanians. So these kinds of dances, these kinds of songs have more distinction from town to town than they do necessarily between Lebanon writ large, let's say, and Palestine writ large, let's say. And in fact, a similar parallel could be made to the music and dances of Italy, where each town, because of the large historical fragmentation of Italy, has its own foods, has its own dances, has its own songs and music that is differentiated region by region. Another key point to talk about with regard to Palestinian culture is its stress on literacy. Palestinians are viewed both internally by other Palestinians and by non-Palestinian Arabs as being among the more educated populations in the Arab world, and that persists today, even with the geopolitical situation that Palestinians find themselves in. Two particular individuals that I wanted to point out here are Mahmoud Darwish and Edward Said. Mahmoud Darwish is famous as a poet. He was born just before the 1948 war, and much of his poetry is about, one, the memory of Palestine and how it influences his thought process and his ability to connect to other people. And the second part is the humanization of both Palestinians and, surprisingly, for many of his supporters, of the Israelis. He's written one or two poems where he's actually discussed what must a soldier be thinking in a way that humanizes the Israelis in a way that a lot of other Palestinians don't do. And as we pointed out in several different presentations, poetry in the Arab world is generally the way of speaking truth to power. This has been a way in the various oppressive Arab governments from the Caliphate period onward through the Ottoman and Safavid empires. People wrote poetry as a way of speaking words that they otherwise could not say. And so Darwish himself becomes sort of a replicator of that phenomenon among the Palestinians. Edward Said is particularly famous for reorienting the perspective by which Westerners would understand the Middle East. He dubbed the historical tradition that had existed before him and before the 1950s as Orientalism. Many individuals who practiced Orientalism also called themselves Orientalists, but his view was even larger, saying that the imposition of Western strictures and Western understandings onto the Middle East and expectations of Western behavior in the Middle East were themselves grounded in a Western sense of supremacy and entitlement. And so this was a major contribution that he brought up in his essay on Orientalism. Now, I have a question of which countries in the Middle East are less well educated. Yemen is particularly well known in an infamous sort of way for being undereducated. It's estimated that the literacy rate among women is about 30%. There are a number of other countries that were illiterate as a historical matter, but because of oil wealth, this has been changed. Saudi Arabia is a perfect example. So is Oman and the United Arab Emirates. Those countries until about the 1970s had really bad literacy rates. Algeria had a persistent lack of education that we talked about in episode 60. One, because of the French mandatory authority refusing to allow Algerians to receive an Arabic education, so or a French education, unless they would assimilate and lose their religion. So you have a lot of different cases, but the Palestinians are historically known for being well educated. In fact, there are several major universities in the West Bank and a few Islamic universities that Hamas still protects in Gaza. Aside from the ability of Arab Israelis, most of whom are ethnic Palestinians, to receive education in Israeli schools. And many of them, in fact, if you just take the Christians within Israel, who are overwhelmingly ethnic Palestinian, they are doing academically better than the majority Jewish population. So that should give you an idea about the thought process here. And as we pointed out, the Falah generally divide into two religions. The Christians were more numerous in the past. They are mostly Greek Orthodox in terms of their orientation, and the Greek Orthodox Church in the Arab world uses Arabic as its language of prayer. So it is far more integrated into the Arab world than some of the other versions of Christianity, which use a foreign language. And additionally, unlike the Catholic Church, which has a unitary pope, the Orthodox churches have their own autocephalous leaders. So the leaders in the Arab world respond in the Arab world and have no direct correspondence as inferior to a superior with any other patriarch. They are equal as individuals. And of course, the majority of Palestinians are Sunni Muslim. All right, so now we need to track the chain of citizenship. This is where we get into the really boring legal stuff, which makes me very excited. And I'm going to try and put you guys not to sleep as well as I can. So you have the Ottoman Empire, and within the Ottoman Empire, all of the population within the territory of Palestine are individuals that have Ottoman subjecthood. But under the Treaty of Lausanne, which was a treaty that was signed between Britain, France, a number of Western powers, and Turkey after the Turkish War of Independence. For more on that, you can go to episodes 47 and 48, where we talked about the Turkish War of Independence. But at the end of that war, Turkey had established itself as a new country. And it's really important to point out that the Turkish War of Independence wasn't just declared against the Greeks, the French, the Italians, the British, and the Armenians. It was declared as well against the Ottoman Caliphate itself. If we remember, the Ottomans had capitulated to the Entente powers at the end of World War I, and accordingly, the Ottoman Empire was supporting the Entente powers in that process of occupation. Ataturk and all of the Turks who refused by the terms that the Entente powers were imposing on Turkey formed their own rebellion, and that rebellion was what created the Republic of Turkey. So the Republic of Turkey did not consider itself necessarily the successor state to the Ottoman Empire. It saw itself as inheriting some things from that empire in terms of land, in terms of language, in terms of culture and history, certainly, but they didn't see the concept of Ottoman citizenship as necessarily passing to all people in the Ottoman Empire being converted into Turkish citizenship. And in fact, they limited the area to which people would become citizens of the Republic of Turkey to those areas that the Treaty of Lausanne guaranteed to the Turkish Republic. Palestine was not one of those regions. Palestine was given as a mandate to the British under the Treaty of Versailles, and this was respected by the Treaty of Lausanne. So, under the treaty, the British were required, as the occupying authority, to issue their own citizenship for the region. And so, in 1925, 2 years after the Treaty of Lausanne, the British issued the Palestinian Citizenship Order of 1925. Now, this created what I'm going to call mandatory Palestinian citizenship. And by mandatory, I mean related to the mandate, not that it was required or obligatory. So this mandatory Palestinian citizenship had one major requirement, which we're going to see is going to be a difficulty for some Palestinians in the diaspora. You had to have habitually been living in the territory of the mandate on the first day of August in 1925. If you were habitually living in the territory and you were a former Ottoman subject, you became a Palestinian citizen, a mandatory Palestinian citizen. But then we have to follow, where does that chain lead? In much the same way that the Republic of Turkey did not see itself as the legitimate successor of the Ottoman Empire, it had risen up in rebellion against the Ottoman Empire. When Israel became a nation state in 1948, it did not see itself as the legitimate successor of the British Mandate of Palestine. And therefore, it argued that this mandatory Palestinian citizenship was no longer a valid document that it would recognize. So, what did the Israelis do in order to create citizenship? Citizenship in Israel actually wasn't established until 1952. So between 1948, when Israel claims that there is no validity to the mandatory Palestinian citizenship, and 1952, there are actually no citizens of the State of Israel. And in fact, Israeli elections that took place during this period didn't actually check for the citizenship of the voters because there was no such thing. They actually did it based on land registration. So in 1952, Israel passes the nationality law. And the nationality law basically captures people in two buckets. The first bucket is the subset called the law of return. So the law of return was passed in 1950, and it allowed all Jews, no matter where they were in the world. There were certain requirements, but generally speaking, all Jews, no matter where they were in the world, to come to Israel and live. It did not grant citizenship until the nationality law of 1952, but the nationality law of 1952 basically said that anybody who came into Israel under the law of return, that person could become an Israeli citizen. So that takes care of the Jewish population. No problems there. The second part would take care of the non-Jewish population in the state of Israel. Now, when Israel became independent and the ceasefires were all signed in 1949, roughly 20%, 15 to 20% of the population of the state of Israel was non-Jewish. So you needed to account for that bucket. And so what the nationality law says is that if, one, you are a resident in Israel in 1949, such that the inhabitants registration document of 1949 records your presence in the state, and you're still in the state in 1952, you've lived in Israel from 1949 till 1952, then you are able to get Israeli citizenship. And this is where the Israeli Arab population comes from. This is the Palestinian citizens of Israel. This is the Druze. This is the Bedouins. All of these populations can demonstrate that they were Israeli inhabitants in 1949, and they were on that registry, and they stayed until 1952. But you can imagine that there were significant numbers of Palestinians for whom this did not grant them Israeli citizenship. So, in particular, you have those that were not in territories administered by Israel between the years of 1949 and 1952, right? The biggest group of those were those who went to Jordan. And in 1948, in the Jericho Conference in December of 1948, the Jordanians annexed the West Bank by act of Jordanian law. Internationally speaking, this was an illegal act. Only 5 countries, Great Britain being the most prestigious of them, recognized the legitimacy of the Jordanian annexation. So, what's interesting from the Jordanian perspective is that when Jordan passed its own law of nationality in 1954, it granted citizenship almost in reverse to what Israel had done. It excluded the population that was Jewish in the former mandate, but those who could demonstrate that they had habitually lived prior to the war. So non-Jews prior to the war and living now in the territory of the Kingdom of Jordan, which included the West Bank. Those people would be given citizenship. So you now have this situation where Jordanians on the East Bank and the West Bank are both citizens of the Kingdom of Jordan. And despite the West Bank being physically small relative to the rest of Jordanian territory, it was actually roughly the same amount of people because that area is so much denser. So Jordan maintains control of this territory from 1949 until 1967, when it loses the Six-Day War to Israel. But under Jordanian law, the West Bank remained part of Jordan until Jordan legally severed it in 1988. So in 1988, you have all of this system beginning to come apart. And the writing on the wall happened even earlier. So in 1983, the Jordanians created the color-coded transit system because they realized that the West Bank was under Israeli military control. But there were Palestinians who were Jordanian citizens on both sides of the Jordan River. And those families, those individuals would keep moving between their families on either side of the Jordan River. So it made no sense from an organizational point of view to not allow these families to interact. And in order to do that, they created the card system. Now, if you were a Palestinian who lived in Jordan, you got this yellow card that you can see on the right-hand side. Those are the ones who lived on the East Bank of the Jordan. They have rights and access to all Jordanian government provisions and government services. Just to the left of that, you have the green, which was given to Jordanian citizens living on the West Bank, right? Now under Israeli military occupation, they can come into Jordan, they can visit their families for an extended period of time. They are permitted to do some kinds of work, but generally speaking, while they have freedom of movement, they don't have all the rights of a citizen. And then, of course, you have the blue card, which effectively was given to Palestinians who never got Jordanian citizenship. Perhaps they moved to the West Bank after it had been severed from Jordan in 1967. Perhaps they were from the Gaza Strip. And people who had this blue card could basically do nothing. It was very difficult for them to get into Jordan, very difficult for them to stay in Jordan, and certainly impossible for them to use any Jordanian resources. And so it is this blue card population in Jordan, which of Jordan's roughly 2 million Palestinian population, we're talking about 140 to 200,000. They are the ones who are forced to live in refugee camps because they cannot work. They cannot make a living. They cannot live their lives in Jordan as normal citizens. Another piece that's worth pointing out here, and perhaps I should have said it earlier, is that in nearly every Middle Eastern state, the law of citizenship inheritance is jus sanguinis, meaning that you inherit your citizenship from your parent. Being born in a certain place does not confer upon you any form of citizenship. It matters what your parents were. And in particular, in most Arab countries, it matters who your father is. Mothers, except in very extreme circumstances, such as the father being of unknown nationality or stateless nationality, cannot determine the nationality of their children. And so you have this very weird situation where if a Palestinian blue card woman marries a Jordanian man, their children will be Jordanian. If the reverse were to happen, a Palestinian blue card man marries a Jordanian woman, those children will be blue card Palestinians. They will not be Jordanians. And so this has made romance in Jordan, if it was difficult before, it becomes even more difficult now. But Jordan isn't the only country. And in fact, Jordan is probably the best situation outside of the Middle East and possibly Israel, depending on how you see it, for the Palestinians. After the 48 war, UNRWA was created, the United Nations Relief and Work Agency. And that agency was designated by the United Nations, so we're going to discuss a little bit more about how it works and all of this, to create refugee camps for the Palestinians who had been displaced in the war. Now, roughly 720,000 to 780,000, depending on whose estimates you believe, Palestinians fled the nation state of Israel. The conditions of that flight vary from person to person. In some cases, they were directly harassed by Israeli soldiers. In other cases, they feared such harassment but didn't actually experience it themselves. And in other cases, they believed that the Arab states would win the war against Israel, and so they left in order to be outside of the battle zone, expecting to return later. Regardless of the reason that they were no longer in their historic homes, they weren't there. And so all of these camps were created and administered by UNRWA to take care of this population. With the exception of Jordan, which, as I just explained, gave nationality to those Palestinians who had fled, none of the other Arab states granted nationality. Syria did not, Lebanon did not, Egypt did not. And in fact, we're going to see a huge tension, especially in the case of Lebanon and Jordan, between these Palestinian populations and the otherwise indigenous populations of those states. In Egypt, because Egypt controlled the Gaza Strip, Egypt created their own puppet government called the All Palestine government that issued its own passports and had no ability to do anything except with the Egyptian say-so. Palestinians who were in Gaza could not leave Gaza and come to Egypt. And of course, at this time, Israel was a hostile state with regard to Egypt. So the blockade that exists around Gaza today, with the exception of the sea, was effectively in existence at that point as well for most Palestinians living in Gaza. There's also a point that I should make regarding guest workers. So in addition to the states where UNRWA was active, that is Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and the Palestinian territories, by which I mean the West Bank and Gaza, Palestinians ended up serving as guest workers in a number of other countries, in particular Kuwait, where at the height there were 400,000 Palestinian guest workers. These guest workers lived in these countries, but did not have any rights to stay in these countries. And so they would have to keep getting their passports renewed, their visas extended. And of course, since citizenship is entirely by jus sanguinis, right, entirely by blood, there was no way that their children or anybody that they were connected to would inherit their citizenship. And especially since most of these are men, and Arab states tend to favor citizenship passing exclusively by the father, you have this situation where most of these guest workers, who are disproportionately men, effectively can find no means or no method of integrating with the host population. Now, there's a question as to why were the Palestinians not able to be welcome in neighboring countries. We're going to talk a little bit about why that was an issue in Lebanon. In Jordan, as I said, they became citizens. In Syria, the primary function was to use them as a weapon against the state of Israel. Syrians were actually quite straightforward about it. In Egypt, they didn't want them competing with the Egyptian population on a labor perspective. Egypt has had a massive overpopulation problem since the British period, and so that not allowing them to move on from being guest workers is that Gulf states, generally speaking, gave benefits to the various different entities, various different citizens, and if they found some way to make Palestinians into citizens of those countries, they would receive those benefits and possibly bankrupt the government. So there's that. There's also a certain degree of nativism that exists in a lot of these countries. And despite the rhetoric of we're all Arabs, we all hang together, that's simply not the historical reality of how Arabs have treated other Arabs. When we talk about the current Palestinian passport, we have to understand what a passport is and what a passport does, because the Palestinian passport fails one of these two requirements. The first one is that a passport functions as what's called a laissez-passer, meaning a document that lets you pass into another country, right? That's when you show your passport to a customs official of a foreign country, or perhaps your home country, to say, let me through. I am from this region, right? And we have a pre-existing agreement that, let's say I have a US passport, right? That I'm from the US, you have a pre-existing agreement with the US government regarding US citizens, I can let pass into your country. Okay, that's function number one. Function number two is as a demonstration of citizenship. This is when you show the passport to your own government and you say, hi, this is proof that I am able to work in this country. This is proof that I am the person I say I am, that I am this many years old, all the rest. This is a government document that you produced, and therefore it demonstrates this information. Palestinian passports are only passports in the sense of laissez-passer. They are documents that show that a person is from Palestine and that they can go through customs in other countries relative to how they have treatment of Palestinian nationals. But it doesn't serve the function of demonstrating citizenship in Palestine. And in fact, to date, the Palestinian Liberation Organization and the Palestinian Authority, the organization and the government that are probably the most central to the Palestinian national story, have not passed a nationality law. In 1995, they came close, but they didn't actually pass it. And so there is, to date, no Palestinian citizenship that it is possible for a person to acquire. Now, there's a question, what's the difference between nativism and nationalism? I would say that nationalism is the patriotic assertion of a certain ethnic group's right to self-governance. And I would say nativism is the idea of people in such a state not wanting foreigners to enter it, and not wanting people that they see as undesirable minorities to live in it. All right, so sort of a crash course on Levantine history. If you want the extended version, there are a number of episodes I would direct you to, probably episode 2, 3, 4, episode 24 as well. 10 through 12 cover the Crusades. So, but there are a few points that I want to sort of bring up here. The first one is that the first time we see Arabs in a serious sense outside of the desert and west of the Jordan River is after the initial invasions of the Arabo-Islamic Caliphate. We're talking about the caliphate that was identified as the Rashidun Caliphate under the authority of Caliph Omar. During this period, there was certainly a movement of Arabian people from the peninsula into the Levant region. And we have to remember that until the 20th century, the population of the Levant region was quite a bit smaller than it is now. Currently, if we take the populations of the former Mandate of Palestine, that's Israel and the Palestinian territories combined, we have a population of roughly 12.5 million. At the beginning of the 20th century, that entire population was about 900,000, which should show you how meteorically the population has risen just in the 20th century alone and 21st century. So at this point in history, the population in the Levant was certainly higher than it was in Arabia. Arabia was almost entirely nomadic, but it was not so substantially high that these invading Arab Muslims were not able to make a demographic dent in the population. So that's that first invasion in the 7th century. We also see that the term Palestine or versions of it were used in reference to the territory both before this period. The Romans called it Palestina after defeating the 4th Jewish revolt in 135 CE in order to try and scrub away the Jewish history of the region. But we also see that the Umayyads, which were the successor dynasty to the Rashidun Caliphate, divided their territory into a number of provinces. And one of those provinces is Jund Palestine, or the military governorate of Palestine. Now, that military governorate did not have its own autonomous authority, right? It was part of the larger Umayyad Caliphate. And in fact, there is no Muslim majority state prior to the 20th century that had its primary headquarters in the former Mandate of Palestine, but we do see from time and time again that this region or parts of this region would take on the name Jund Philistine. Now, one of the things that we also have to realize is that there was a cultural conversion of the population under the rule of the Umayyads and the Abbasids, which is that period from the mid 600s until the early 1000s, right? Because after that point you have the Crusades, and then there's a little bit of change, and then there becomes again this process of reacculturation to the Middle East. And this process is called Arabization. And there are several key pieces that go into this. The first part is, of course, they begin speaking Arabic. They begin dressing in Arab clothes. They begin abandoning their traditional languages that they had spoken before, especially Aramaic, which was one of the dominant languages of the Levant, Greek as well. And they begin to trade and operate in much the way that the Arabians who had invaded did. And this process called Arabization, or ta'arib, was a slow but methodical process. And it was a process in the sense that it was a set of stages that occurred, but it wasn't a process in the sense of an implemented governing policy. It was simply the way that assimilation works, the same way that immigrants who come to the United States after 2 or 3 generations, their kids are speaking English as their dominant language, they're dressing according to American custom, they're eating American foods like pizza and hamburgers, right? There's this process that occurs over time, even though there's nobody who passed the law of making immigrants American. In the same way, Arabization occurred in the Middle East context. And so these various populations who, prior to the Arabo-Islamic conquest, would have considered themselves, let's say, Roman citizens, Byzantine citizens, Greek speakers, Aramaic speakers, Jews, Christians, or other forms of identity, would have added this Arab identity to those other identities. All right. So when we're in the Ottoman period, the Ottomans controlled the region of Mandatory Palestine from the year 1517, when they defeated the Mamluks and at the Battle of Marj-Dabik. So they then parceled out their territories to a number of nobles, we could say, who controlled the territory. Probably the most famous of these was Dahr al-Umar, and you can sort of see him in the center in the city of Acre, which is in northern Israel today. And you can see the territory that he controls roughly corresponds to the northern half of the state of Israel, and some territories that belong to Jordan, and some small territories that belong to the West Bank. He was at war with a number of other individuals who were also nominally under Ottoman control. One thing to remember about the Ottoman Empire is that the closer you were to Constantinople, the more power the Sultan actually had in regulating the day-to-day affairs. Once you got outside of the Anatolian Peninsula, you started getting into the Middle East. Until the end of the 19th century, with the Tishkali Biliyat and Nizam Namesi in 1862 and things like that, the Ottoman Empire couldn't effectively control these regions. And so what effectively happened is that these nobles began to become their own leaders of separate regions, and they would go to war with each other, war with individuals who at least nominally were also Ottoman vassals. And occasionally the Ottoman government would send military leaders in order to stop the fighting between countries that were supposedly all part of the Ottoman Empire. So that should give you a sense of the autonomy of these various states. Dahr al-Umar is seen as a hero to Palestinians today in sort of creating the idea of a Palestinian state, even though if you had asked him, he wouldn't have identified as a Palestinian. He wouldn't understand what that term meant. And his state wasn't based on any ethno-national claims like modern Palestinians would make. But what they admire about him is not necessarily those attributes, which of course he doesn't have, but the way he actually administered the province. And so there are a few things to point out here. Dahr al-Umar was very favorable to non-Muslim minorities, in particular Jews and Christians, and he facilitated the immigration of Jews and Christians to the regions he controlled because he saw the Jews as expert tradesmen and expert merchants, and he saw the Christians as expert artisans. And so you began to create Christian communities that existed all throughout what is today northern Israel as a direct result of his policies towards inward migration. In addition to the Jews and Christians that he was willing to bring in, he was also willing to facilitate business. And in particular, he was willing to facilitate business from the direction that he would guarantee credit for farmers who wanted to go into farming cotton, which was a massive cash crop. And so because he was willing to put his own money on the line, he was able to facilitate the growth of this large-scale industry. And that's another thing that Palestinians really value about him, which is that he was willing to expend of his own largesse to create a functional Palestinian state. And I'm using that term Palestinian in the regional sense, not in the ethnic sense. We also see that there is a distinct understanding of Levantine identity, at least, by the mid-19th century. And we've sort of talked about this with the Shami dialects and the ledgers in Egypt. This was actually Muhammad Ali's Egypt. Muhammad Ali was ruling in this period. And in 1834, there was a war between Muhammad Ali in Egypt and the Ottoman Empire. Muhammad Ali was at least nominally a vassal state of the Ottoman Empire, but he had become so strong and capable, especially because he had created a modern army where the Ottoman Empire had not. He was on the verge of conquering the Ottoman Empire. And if you want to hear more about that, I talk about that in episode 30, and there are several follow-up episodes that discuss that as well. But as part of this war overall, he manages to conquer the entire Levant region. And so we see actual clashes between the indigenous Levantine population and the Egyptian invading population. And inevitably, both of these invasions end up targeting the Jews. So you have a situation, for example, when Ibrahim Pasha, who was the son of Muhammad Ali on the Egyptian side, was camping at Jaffa, and he made demands regarding corvée labor, which is unpaid labor, and he demanded the people who are going to anachronistically call Palestinians to start building highways for him. In order to resist, a number of agitators argued that the Jews in Sfat were collaborating with Ibrahim Pasha, and so they sacked and looted their territory. On the flip side, when Ibrahim Pasha was retreating, he again had resistance from Palestinians in the path of this retreat. The Egyptian control had divested power from a lot of the localized elites that had taken power during the Ottoman period, people like Zahr al-Omar, even though this was after that particular individual had died. And in pursuit of the Palestinians in the city of Hebron, Ibrahim Pasha believed that the Jews were in alliance with the Palestinians. This is the old Yishuv we're talking about, right? The Jews who were indigenous to the land at that time. And Ibrahim Pasha's forces slaughtered the Jews at the Battle of Hebron. One of the things that's critically important to understand when we're talking about the West Bank, and we covered it a little bit last week, is the idea of the dead lands. So the Ottomans passed a land reform in 1858 after they had recovered the territory in the Levant from the Egyptians. And they had passed this Ottoman land code, which we described more in depth in episode 26, that allowed for a number of different types of land registration. But what's critical to take from this is that the Arazi Mavet, or dead lands, had a reverter to the state. And so under Ottoman law, if land was not being used, it wasn't mamluk, it wasn't owned by a private individual, it wasn't mevkuf, it wasn't part of a waqf or a charitable trust, It wasn't matruk, meaning that it wasn't shared between different individuals, like a road or a grain silo that multiple people would put grain into. But it was just simply unused land. It was what would be termed dead land. And that dead land would then become arazi miri, or state-owned land. And this law was designed with the purpose that unused land could be reallocated to people who would use it. And so this became a defining feature of Ottoman land codes. And we're going to see how that applies in the case of the West Bank as we go through. So as the Ottoman Empire moved into its centralization, you begin to see a redivision of the various territories. You can see the most of that action happened further away from Constantinople, but you also have divisions closer to it. And when you had this, you had a complete reorganization of the territories. Now, one point that I want to make, because it's something that we will see also later, and I'm using the Battle of Ain Dara as an example. This is a battle in Lebanon. When we look at conflicts in the Levant region, people have a tendency to want to group individuals and clans according to their religious identity, saying that it's the Sunni Muslims versus the Maronite Christians, or the Shiite Muslims versus the Jews. And there will be times when I will use that as a shorthand. But it's important to point out that that's usually not the way that these break down. They break down according to clan alliances. So, for example, I want to point out that if we look at the Battle of Ain Dara, the Jumblat clan is a Druze clan. The Yemeni faction are also Druze. The difference is entirely based on which sets of other groups are aligned with those groups. The Shihabs at this period, the Shihabs will later convert to Maronite Christianity, but the Shihabs at this period are Muslim, Sunni Muslim. Then you have a number of the Khazan clan, which are Christian. You have a number of these different groups that are sort of aligning together, and it's more about territorial power and often about economics, because in this case, the Jumblats and the Yemenis, the Shihabs and the Jumblats were both landowners. The Yemenis were a different set of landowners, and the question was over which one of these clans would have a larger share of territory, therefore a larger rental income, and therefore the ability to have more wealth. So as the Ottomans begin to centralize more and more in the latter half of the 19th century, you have these feelings of nationalism that begin to surge. And in particular, we have Levantine and Arab nationalism that come to the fore. And in particular, I want to draw your attention to Georgi Zaidan. Georgi Zaidan was a Greek Orthodox Christian, like most of the Palestinians were, although he, if we use the term anachronistically, would be Lebanese. And his view was that there was a distinct Arab Levantine identity, and that this identity had a lot to do with Muslim Arab culture, that Muslim history to him was incredibly important in understanding the place that even Christians had to play in the structure of the Levantine identity. And in fact, he produced a magazine called Al-Hilal, which went through many of the foundational stories of Muslim history from the early days of Muhammad and the Caliphate all the way to more recent events like the invasion of Muhammad Ali into the Levant. And what did these moments and turning points say about culture, and how could Arabs begin to understand their place in this situation that they found themselves in the Ottoman Empire, which was increasingly moving towards a stronger Turkish identity in addition to sort of the Ottoman subject identity. But he wasn't the only one. There began to be a push across the Levant for Syrian nationalism. You have Boutros al-Bustani, who was Protestant, Anton al-Saudeh, who was also Greek Orthodox. And these individuals began to argue that the modern countries, if we use those terms in terms of their territory anachronistically, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Israel, and the Palestinian territories were a large single identity of Bilad Hashem, of the Levant, of Greater Syria. And these areas were defined by their own unique culture and language, their religious diversity, which was relatively unique in the Arab world, by their particular dialectical features. And in fact, Antoine Saada spent a significant amount of time trying to use and formalize a Levantine dialect that would be understood by all people in the Levant, and would use localized words as opposed to traditional Arabic, which Boutros al-Bustani was famous for writing in. There was an idea about the relationship that the Mediterranean had as a gateway between Europe and the Arab world. In fact, one of the debates in Lebanon, and we'll discuss this when we talk about Lebanon more in depth, probably in about a month, is that there was a strong pull in the Levant towards having a strong relationship with Europe as well as with the Arab world. So there was, and that was, of course, a source of political friction in Lebanon as to whether the relationship with Europe would be prioritized or the relationship with the Arab world would be prioritized. But there's this sense of a uniform identity that doesn't quite distinguish yet between the current identities of Lebanese, Syrian, Jordanian, Israeli, and Palestinian. And so we really have to sort of see that Palestinian nationalism, or what I'm calling Palestinianism, the idea that Palestinians are a distinct ethnic group, right? This idea of Palestinianism really doesn't develop until the 20th century. Now we have the first case of somebody using the term Palestinian to refer to this as an ethnic group in the writings of Khalil Baidas, and this is in the year 1897. He refers to Palestinians. He was translating a number of documents from Russian into Arabic, and he uses the word Palestini to refer to the indigenous population of the Levant, specifically in the southwestern Levant. But that doesn't mean that the term was widespread. It would take some time for the term to catch on. Probably the biggest source of that was the Palestine newspaper, whose first edition came out in 1911. And this newspaper obviously popularized the term Palestine as the reference to the territory. We also have the creation of the Palestinian flag. Now, the Palestinian flag is itself a creation, or rather, a reinterpretation of the 1916 Arab Revolt flag. And so it's a flag that doesn't come from the territory itself. It's a flag that comes from Palestine's larger association with the Arab ethnicity that would happen over time. One point to make about Palestinian organization at this point is that it is very minimal. And what ends up happening is that in order to deal with the British period, right, that begins in the 1920s, the Palestinians, if we can use that term anachronistically again, begin to form what is called the Arab Higher Committee. This is a committee with the various clan leaders from the major clans across the territory of the British Mandate of Palestine. In particular, if you look in the lower left-hand corner, you have Raghib Nashashibi of the Nashashibi clan. This is probably the most powerful clan in Jerusalem. And Amin al-Husseini, who is the leader of the second most powerful clan in Jerusalem. The Nashashibis in particular are very famous for being the holders of the keys of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, because none of the Christian groups could trust any of the other Christian groups to hold the key. If they did, they might lock the other Christians out. And the church is a shared church between the various different sects. But the Nashashibis, as a prominent Muslim family, were entrusted to hold the key, and they still do. There's also a fundamental distinction between how these two powerful individuals wanted to deal with both the British and with the increasing pressure from Zionism. Raghib Nashashibi wanted a conciliatory approach. He was still opposed to the creation of a Jewish national state, but he felt that in the long run, negotiating with the Zionist representatives would be something that would permit the Palestinians perhaps to be in a better position, of course, using that term Palestinians anachronistically. Amin al-Husseini believed in a more violent and radical approach, and in fact was famous for his alliance with Nazi Germany throughout World War II, which was directly related to his desire to instigate violent revolt against the British in the former Mandate. So we now get to World War I. World War I, of course, is where the Ottoman Empire finally loses complete control of the Levant region. And in particular, it loses control of the Mandate of Palestine, but the British have two separate agreements. Now, the first one is what's called the Hussein-McMahon Correspondence. And in 1915, Lieutenant Colonel Sir Vincent Arthur Henry McMahon talks to Sharif Hussein of Mecca and argues that if the Sharif will bring the Arabs into the war on the British side, that he will grant him a unitary state that will control all of the Middle East with some small exceptions. The small exceptions he outlines in the correspondence are Mersina, Alexandretta, and portions of Syria lying to the west of the districts of Damascus, Hama, Homs, and Aleppo. In fact, if we look at the map on the right-hand side, you can see the area. If you take a literal reading of what he says, you can see the four cities of Aleppo, Hama, Homs, and Damascus sort of on this dotted line, and then extend that area to the coast. That is the Arab interpretation of what Vincent Arthur Henry McMahon was excluding. And you can see that all of the territory of the former British Mandate of Palestine would be within that unitary Arab state. The British interpretation later, when trying to reconcile this with the Balfour Declaration, which we'll get to in a second, and other obligations that they had, was to argue that this line should be extended all the way down to the Red Sea, and therefore those areas of what would become Mandatory Palestine should also be excluded from the unitary Arab state. And of course, suffice it to say, because we know what the Middle East looks like today, and we know what the mandatory period in the Middle East looked like as well, this did not happen. This is not a unitary Arab state did not come into existence in all the territories on green if you look at the left-hand side map. Despite this, the Arab revolt did take place. Sharif Hussein was able to create in Saudi Arabia. You can see the soldiers who marshaled in Yanbu. It's also worth pointing out that these were among the least capable soldiers in World War I. And the Ottoman Empire, while it could not send large contingents to face them, given the fact that it was fighting a war on 5 fronts, as we've discussed several times, but most prominently in episode 43 and 44, the Ottoman Empire could only allocate 10,000 troops to deal with the Arab revolt, but those 10,000 soldiers basically held the entire Arab revolt in a standstill. But as you can see, the flag that was used in the Arab revolt was the flag that gave rise to a number of different Middle Eastern flags, in particular the flag of the Kingdom of Iraq, which is no longer in use, the flag of the Kingdom of Jordan, which is still in use, and of course, the Palestinian flag. All right, so of course you had the other promise, and that's the Balfour Declaration. And the Balfour Declaration was used by the British government in the thought that it would increase Jewish participation in World War I, both in terms of recruiting and in terms of financial growth and development, in order to pay for all of the various war aims. We begin to see at the end of World War I that there are some questions as to what are the borders of the future mandates, how would they be organized, and in particular, after World War I, the Turkish territories were divided into occupied regions. In particular, Occupied Territory Administration North, Occupied Enemy Territory Administration West, and occupied enemy territory south. North and east, northeast and south. Regardless, the south roughly corresponded to the territory of the former British Mandate, but the border in the north had not yet been settled. And so what you end up having is a number of internecine battles between Zionist settlers, the new Yishuv, and the Palestinian population. Again, I'm going to use that term repeatedly anachronistically. One of the earliest battles was the Battle of Tel Chai, which was just north of what is today Kfar Giladi, in the territory of in the country of Israel. But as you can see from the map, that was territory that could have belonged to OETA North. It's in that red area because where Israel has that sort of upward hoop. And so a number of Shiite Muslims who are local to that area believed that these were Jewish settlers moving into Lebanon and enforcing British claims over Lebanon, and so they fought them. There were also the Debi Musa riots, where Palestinians were thoroughly enraged by the move towards a mandate, especially since that mandate would be ruled, at least initially, by a Zionist sympathetic British administrator. And a number of Jews were killed in the Nebi Musa riots. So it's worth pointing out that a lot of people use the term Ottoman Palestine, but the Ottomans didn't divide the territory into one entity. They actually divided it into three. So you can see the Vilayet of Beirut indicated there in the green, which extended all the way from Latakia, which is in Syria today, coastal Syria, to the Sanjak of Balqa, which is the northern 40% of the West Bank. And all of this is part of the Vilayet of Beirut, cut into several Sanjaks. And even the Sanjaks themselves don't quite match the border. You can see the Sanjak of Akkar, it ends further south than Israel does today. And the Sanjak of Beirut, of course, extends further north of where that border is. You can also see that Jerusalem is itself an independent Sanjak, and the southernmost territory, the territory that borders the Red Sea, is part of the Sanjak of Massa in the larger Vilayet of Syria, or the Vilayet of Damascus. It's called both. And all of those territories exist on the east bank of the Jordan River, and then, of course, after the Jordan River sort of ends in the Dead Sea, continuing all the way to the border with Egypt, which, of course, was independent, or rather under British occupation, not Ottoman occupation. So you start having pressure against Viscount Herbert Samuel, who was a Jewish Briton, and as I said, a Zionist sympathetic. And Muslims began to rally around a number of different figures, given that he was from a prominent family. The British believed that they could promote Amin al-Husseini to the position of Grand Mufti, and in that position, he would be able to coordinate and organize the Palestinian community and prevent them from causing more harm to the British and permitting the long-term occupation. They were very mistaken in this. So during this period, the Zionists began to have increasingly negative interactions with the Palestinians, and the Palestinians likewise. And so you see two major moves on the side of the new Yishuv, that is the Zionist settlers. The first one is that they begin to promote the creation of relationships with other indigenous populations that are not Palestinians. We're talking about the Druze, the Circassians, the Bedouins. And in fact, during the Mandate period, Zionists went out of their way to facilitate relationships with these individuals and protect them in their claims against Palestinians. In many cases, right, because, for example, the Druze have their own religion, and as a post-Islamic religion, Muslims are very hesitant to recognize or permit post-Islamic religions. they were able to protect Druze around the shrine of Nabi Shuaib, Prophet Shuaib, usually translated as Jethro, which is a holy site for them. There were relationships with the Circassians, where the Jews and the Circassians got on rather well, especially because of their shared history as expulsion victims from Russia. And so they actually had that language in common as well. But even more prominent than them reaching out to outsiders was their desire to protect themselves. The Battle of Tel Hai proved to the Zionists that they needed to defend themselves if they wanted to have any chance of creating a state in the long run, especially with the Palestinians already living there. So the first militia that the Jews created was called the Haganah. And the Haganah was made from a number of World War I veterans. If we remember from episode 45, we had the Zionist Mule Corps, which was a division of New Yishuv Jews who fought under the British banner in a number of the localized Middle Eastern campaigns. And so these individuals had battle expertise and were able to form an effective resistance. The Haganah continued to be the Mandatory Palestine Jews' largest militia and underground organization. And it evolved in 1941 to have a special division called the Palmach, which was sort of their advanced special reconnaissance. There were also those who didn't see eye to eye with the mission of the Haganah, and therefore created organizations that would be more militant. The Irgun and the Lakhi were two such organizations. Really, the only differentiator between the Irgun and the Lakhi was that the Lakhi was willing to ally with the Nazis to fight the British, and the Irgun was not willing to do that. Now, on the Palestinian side, we have a lot less of organization. The first thing is that the Palestinians themselves didn't see a need to organize until you got further and further into the Mandate, into the 1930s, and the Jewish population was rising precipitously. So the organization that did come came rather late. You can see the Arab Higher Committee only came into existence in 1936, which means that the Jews had an 11-year head start. And the Arab Higher Committee itself wasn't even a militant group. It was simply a committee to organize the desires of Palestinian Muslims, primarily, as well as Palestinian Christians, as sort of a secondary group. Now, the Arab Higher Committee started at the very tail end of the 1940s, when Haj Amin al-Husseini came back to Palestine. He had been in Nazi-occupied Europe, recruiting SS divisions for Hitler in the Balkans. And as a result of that, he had the experience necessary to create his own division, the Holy Jihad Army. However, that was not the only Palestinian militia that was operating. There was also the Arab Liberation Army. But the Arab Liberation Army is a strange thing, and it's worth taking a second to talk about what it is and how it works. The Arab Liberation Army was created by the Syrians, and was created by the Syrians specifically because the Syrians were afraid that if they sent their own soldiers under the Syrian flag against the Zionists, that they would lose. They were poorly organized, and Syria had only become independent in 1946. So Syria wanted to get the involvement of all of the other Arab states in supporting such a unified militia. But they couldn't get that. So what did they end up doing? They ended up hiring and paying Palestinians to effectively be a Syrian army without the Syrian flag, and therefore would not bring shame upon the Syrians if they lost. That said, their commander, Fawzi al-Qawqji, was a Syrian from the Great Syrian Revolt in 1925, which we discussed in episode 53. And we're going to see this Syrian in Palestinian cosplay several times throughout this discussion of Palestinians. The size of the Holy Jihad Army and the Arab Liberation Army were significantly smaller than the Haganah or the Palmach. And this meant that, functionally speaking, they wouldn't pose the same kind of threat, and was one of the reasons why Arab states often considered intervening in the war in 1948. But before we get to the war in 1948, we have to talk about 1936. So you start having this resentment towards the Jewish migration as early as 1920. There are other attacks like the attack in Hebron in 1929 against Jewish populations in Hebron. And you begin to have a number of Palestinians who are trying to figure out what is a way that they can break free from the British, prevent Zionism from achieving its aims, and assert a local national identity. And into this comes Sheikh Izzeddin Qassam. Sheikh Izzeddin Qassam is one of the early Islamists. If we remember from our discussion of Islamism in episode 63, you have Hassan al-Banna creating the Muslim Brotherhood in 1935. And Izzeddin Qassam is an early adopter of this idea. And the idea of the Muslim Brotherhood is that Muslims as a group have a particular national identity. They have specific politics they want to enact, a certain life that they want to live, and that life should be in accordance with the Sharia. As part of this embrace, he declared the war against the British, the war to liberate Palestine from the British, as a jihad, as a holy war. And this directly put the unorganized or relatively unorganized Palestinians, primarily led by Abdul Qadr al-Husseini, who was a cousin of Hajj Amin al-Husseini, and several Palestinian militias, against the British. In this position, their primary goal, at least in this early part of the conflict, was to get the British to refuse to allow further Jewish immigration. The Jews, therefore, felt that it would be absolutely necessary to prevent the success of this revolution against the British, and they aligned along with the British in putting it down. In particular, the Notrim, which were the Jewish police, the Haganah military police, aligned together to fight alongside the British and stop the Palestinian rebellion, which was at its height in 1936, and then from 1937 to 1939 was a number of cleanup operations. In order to try and solve the issue, the Peel Commission made an attempt, led by Lord Peel, to divide the Mandate of Palestine between two potential states, a Jewish state and an Arab state, and a third territory that the British would maintain under their own control, which would include the historic cities of Jaffa, Jerusalem, and Bethlehem. Neither the Jews nor the Arab Higher Committee were terribly enamored with the Peel White Paper, and the Arab Higher Committee, representing the Palestinians, actually refused to even be in the same room with representatives from the various Zionist organizations, meaning that Peel had to keep shifting from building to building in order to work on the negotiations. Accordingly, the Peel White Paper was never implemented, but what was implemented was the British White Paper of 1939, which was extremely ill-timed, and this White Paper would prevent all Jewish immigration beyond a certain very nominal number. And given that 1939 was really the beginning of the Holocaust, in many ways, Jews have seen this as being part of the reason why more of their population didn't escape war-torn Europe. So in November of 1947, the UN Resolution 181 comes out, and it is approved by the UN General Assembly, which leads to massive street fighting between the new Yishuv and the parts of the old Yishuv that it had incorporated, and on the flip side, the Palestinians. And so this battle goes on for roughly 6 months across the various cities of of the mandate. And additionally, the British tried thanklessly and very ineffectively to prevent these two forces from coming to blows. On the 14th of May, 1948, the British finally departed, and the next day, the Israelis, led by Ben-Gurion, declared the independence of their state, the State of Israel. And this led to Arab countries invading the territory in the hopes of ripping the country apart. Now, it's worth pointing out that the UN partition plan was not accepted in any way by the Arabs, and there are a few reasons why. Similar to the Peel Commission, the Arabs rejected the idea that there should be any separation at all, that there should be a unitary state, and Jews would be an accepted minority in that state. That said, the resolution would divide the country into two states and a separate governance for Jerusalem. The way that these states would be cut would be that the Jewish state would have the majority of the land area and a population that was just majority Jewish, by focusing on the area along the Mediterranean coastline and some of the area around the Sea of Galilee. But even in the Jewish state, as I pointed out, roughly half the population would still be Arab. In the Arab state, there would be practically no Jewish population at all. And this was one of the reasons why they opposed the idea of separation. They didn't feel that the Jewish population was large enough to necessitate a different state, certainly not a state that controlled 56% of the land area. Now, once Israel declared independence, the Palestinians received help, and I'm going to put that help in quotes, from the neighboring Arab countries. And the reason why it should be pointed out like this is that the Arab countries were not invading with the purpose of supporting a nascent Palestinian independence movement. Jordan was explicitly invading with the intention of acquiring Palestinian territory to add to its own state. The Egyptians and the Syrians were invading in the hopes of thwarting the Jordanians from achieving that outcome, and the Lebanese invasion was extremely half-hearted. What that ultimately resulted in was that Israel focused the significant majority of its efforts in liberating Jerusalem and fighting the Jordanians. In fact, the Jordanians had the most advanced soldiers that were involved against Israel. And these soldiers did not particularly care about protecting the Palestinians during the conflict, but neither did the Israelis. And so many of the Palestinians were caught between these Jordanian forces and the Israeli forces, especially when we're talking about civilians on the road between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. In you can see the soldiers at Abu Ghosh. Abu Ghosh are Palestinians. They're currently Palestinian citizens of Israel. And Abu Ghosh was one Arab town that decided to side with the Zionists and therefore become part of Israel. And since they maintained their position between 1949 and 1952, they became citizens of that state, right? We talk about the legal implications. But a number of other Arabs in the towns along this route were not as well treated as those of Abu Ghosh. Probably the most famous of these are the Arabs at Deir Yassin, where it's estimated that 106 Palestinians were massacred by the Irgun, that is a Jewish Zionist terrorist organization. Part of the reason why the Irgun was in fact disbanded was the Israeli public reaction and Israeli governmental reaction to the way that that massacre happened. In the north, we see the Syrian invasion, and we see Fawzi al-Qawqji and his Arab Liberation Army. As I mentioned before, the Arab Liberation Army was an army primarily made by Palestinians, but primarily led by Syrians. And they did about as dismally as the Syrians did. In fact, Israelis made significant gains very early into the Syrian advance, keeping Syria primarily out of the war. And Israel was also able, in Operation Hiram, to take much of northern Israel. Now, this region, if you remember from the map a few pages earlier, is almost exclusively Arab. You can see in the map here, there's almost no blue to be found. And so in that area, you had a large Palestinian contingent, and Operation Hiram moved relatively quickly through it. It's also a very famous operation for the number of villages that were depopulated by the Israeli forces as they moved through this area. It was a particular sore point even within the Israeli high command during the war about how aggressive the Israelis had been toward the local population. And even despite that, this region in Israel is still 75% or more Arab at the present time. On the southern front, what ended up happening was a significant number of Palestinians from what we can call central Israel. That's that area between Netanya on the Mediterranean coast and Beersheba in its center, where a large belt of Palestinians lived. It's in the map in those areas, basically surrounded by the blue boxes. Those populations fled towards Gaza, which was an Egyptian military defense point. And so what ends up happening is that you have one of the most dense population centers created in history as Palestinians are fleeing Israeli soldiers, and they end up in this point. In fact, Gaza has about as many Palestinians as the West Bank does even today, and the size is significantly smaller. To give a sense of the idea of the density of people in Gaza, it's roughly equivalent to Manhattan. So after the war in 48, you have what the Palestinians term the Nakba, or the catastrophe. And the Nakba refers to how between 400 and 500 Palestinian villages were depopulated, and their populations either, and the city and the towns themselves destroyed, the populations themselves moving out of the territory into either the West Bank or Gaza or other locations. And then you have the situation of the naturalization of those Arab citizens who remain, and those who remained within the state of Israel and became Israeli citizens were also subject to martial law. In Israel, there were a number of cities that were declared as Arab cities. These were typically Arab majority cities, places like Nazareth or al-Fahm, that have large Arab populations. And so until 1966, those areas were under Israeli military occupation, despite the individuals of those cities being citizens of the state of Israel. And we talked more on the Israeli side about how there were Arabs who were part of the Israeli government. Saifuddin Zobi was part of the first Knesset, and his alignment was with the Israeli Labor Party. He was given his own party, but in many ways, his policies were circumscribed by the Zionist Jews with whom he aligned. And Tawfiq Ziad was another Palestinian citizen of Israel, and he wrote poetry against the state of Israel and in favor of an independent Palestine. And he wasn't treated well by the Israeli government for what he had to say. So now that we have these Palestinians who are pushed out of the territory, right, we have all this forced migration in various different directions, where the bulk of it ends up going to the West Bank and Gaza. That's over 60%. And then a smattering to East Bank, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. And this all occurs in 1949. And so there needs to be a solution immediately. But the problem is that there is no way to determine how to deal with these people, because the current situation for most refugees is the UNHCR, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. And that wouldn't come into existence until 1950. And it would be based on the 1951 Convention on Refugees. The convention was passed after, but the organization was founded, and then it had its mandate. So as a result, the Palestinians were given a unique organization called UNRWA, or the United Nations Relief and Work Agency. And this organization was set up to take into account the fact that nearly all of the refugees went into one of 5 regions: Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, West Bank, or Gaza. Now, there were 7,000 that went to Egypt and 4,000 that went to Iraq, but these areas were excluded from the mandate of UNRWA given the low numbers, relatively speaking. And UNRWA has a very similar definition to the people within its purview, as did the Jordanians when it came to who would get citizenship in the state of Jordan. Namely, that these individuals were living in Palestine for roughly 2 years before the end of the mandate, and that's how they classified them originally. But one of the unique things about UNRWA relative to other refugees is that refugee status is inheritable. And so UNRWA is one of the only organizations whose mandate has increased simply by dint of the people that it's caring for increasing in number. UNHCR, by and large, operates with the goal of settling somebody in a new country. And then once that person is settled, that person loses refugee status, and refugee status is certainly not inheritable. But under UNRWA, it is. And because UNRWA has existed for so long with this specific mandate of people, it's taken onto itself a number of state-like duties as well. Probably the most famous of these is that it runs its own schools, it has its own hospitals, it has a number of provisions for food and shelter for Palestinians. And so in many ways, it becomes a welfare system for a region that doesn't have welfare systems. It's also not clear when UNRWA is supposed to end, because the only way under UNRWA that Palestinians can stop being refugees is if there's some resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian question. And most of those resolutions come in the form of some implementation of Resolution 194. At least that's the argument from those who support UNRWA. And 194 allows the return of Palestinians to their original homes. But there's a question as to whether that's the exclusive appropriate interpretation of that. If we look at the text of Resolution 194, there are several things that are worth pointing out. First, it's return to their homes, and doesn't necessarily mean their original homes, and it doesn't necessarily mean where they used to live, because the home could just generally be in that wider territory. So that's not clear. It's also not clear with what live at peace with their neighbors would mean. It's certainly not the case that many Palestinians would live at peace with their neighbors, or if they would, on a personal basis, they wouldn't vote for people who would treat their neighbors well. And accordingly, Israel has made the argument that Resolution 194 will be implemented when those caveats can be determined. And so far, they've argued that it cannot be determined. But it is UNRWA's position that the Palestinian refugees will remain refugees until some such resolution comes into existence, which basically means that the Palestinian statelessness and refugee status is interminable. Further to this, we also see the parallel to the jus sanguinis issue that we have in a lot of the Arab states. Citizenship applies through male descent. So refugee status also applies through male descent. Because the thought process is, if a woman refugee marries somebody who is not a refugee, then her children will follow the male line of descent and have that citizenship. So they won't need this process. But that said, there is no reason why, under UNRWA's definition, that you can't have citizenship and also be a Palestinian refugee. And so you have cases, especially in Jordan, where UNRWA counts all 2 million Palestinians as refugees, but most of them have Jordanian citizenship. So you end up with this very sort of strange loophole situation. Now, I wanted to just compare it with UNHCR, which came in 1950 and deals with most other refugees around the world. And so UNHCR has a definition of refugee, which refers to a person who can't live in the country of their origin because of fear of persecution for several different reasons: race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or having a particular political view. And their goal is first to try and see if there's a different place in the country where that person can be situated, where they might be safe. If they can't be situated in their country of origin, then the next best thing is to find a local country with a similar cultural background to settle them and get them citizenship in that country. And if that doesn't work, to take them further afield to perhaps a Western country or something else where they could have a new life. And the moment that they acquire this new citizenship, the moment that their asylum claim is complete, UNHCR counts that as a person done, check mark, move on to the next person. And so UNHCR has its primary goal ending the refugee status of the refugee. Because of that, UNHCR integrated refugees become part and parcel of the countries they live in. UNRWA refugees almost always can't. And so the Palestinians in the various countries where UNRWA operates, especially Syria and Lebanon, are going to have a distinct national identity and a distinct set of political aspirations relative to the host societies in which they live. So we pointed out that you now have this Palestinian diaspora with all these different camps. And just sort of, you can see, this is what the camp in Rafah, which is Rafah is in the westernmost point of the Gaza Strip. So when we're thinking about a refugee camp, we often think of this large row of tents somewhere in the desert. That's not what refugee camps are. These are cities with multiple story buildings, very narrow streets, their own industries. Remember, most of these refugee camps have been in existence since the 1950s. Some of them are more recent, especially if they were built after the 1967 war, because a number of other Palestinians fled after that point. But these are not temporal institutions anymore. These are themselves their own districts and cities of their own creation. After losing the war, the Holy War Army, which had generally been fighting alongside the Egyptians in the Egyptians' failed campaigns, relocated to Gaza, and Egypt christened them the All Palestine Government. This government operated from 1949 to 1959 and issued its own passports. But these passports were functionally worthless because the All Palestine Government was not recognized outside of the Arab world, and the state was functionally an Egyptian puppet, which meant that the Palestinians there couldn't get Egyptian citizenship. The Palestinians there couldn't create any citizenship of their own that was actually meaningful. Again, this Palestinian passport was a laissez-passer. It wasn't a proof of citizenship. And what ends up happening is that the Palestinians effectively become a stateless people, with the exception of those in Israel or in Jordan. And Jordan at this point includes the West Bank, who acquire the citizenship of those countries. Now, one thing that we talked about when we talked about the Lebanese was the mahjar, or the diaspora. And in the case of Lebanon, the diaspora is so massive that it dwarfs the population of Lebanese in Lebanon. To give a certain sense of this, 80% of Lebanese in the 1920s were in Lebanon, were Christian. Today, 40% of Lebanese in Lebanon, 40 to 45% of Lebanese in Lebanon are Christian. But 80% of world Lebanese are Christian. And in Latin America alone, it's estimated that there are over 6 million Lebanese. Lebanese have reached high political levels in Brazil and in Argentina and in Venezuela. Yeah, and of course, in Mexico, the most famous Mexican because of his wealth is Carlos Slim. Carlos Slim is himself a Lebanese, right? So you have this integration, and this integration goes relatively well because most Lebanese that leave are Christian. And so as they're going, especially to Latin America, they're integrating with other Christian populations. Now, Lebanese in particular are Catholic by and large, right? The Maronites, which are the largest percentage of Lebanese, are Catholic. And so they're integrating into Catholic states. There's really no issue there. In the case of Palestinians, they're Greek Orthodox, but they don't really see much of a functional distinction between Greek Orthodox and Catholic to the point where they're going to Catholic Mass. So to talk about the Palestinian diaspora, obviously we can't go over every country and every situation, but there's one that I think that is particularly interesting and telling and should give us a sense of what the situation was like for Palestinians living in the diaspora. And that's the situation of Chile. Now, Palestinians started immigrating to Chile through Brazil or through Argentina beginning in the 1860s. And at this point, Chile had already achieved independence from Spain, and it achieved independence as primarily a white colony. That is to say that it was made of peninsulares and criollos. Peninsulares are Spaniards who were born in Spain, and criollos are Spaniards who are born in Latin America. Simply by question of where you're born, there's no ethnic distinction. So every criollo either has criollo parents or peninsular parents, right? So in the same family, you would have peninsulares and criollos. And the reason for the rebellion in Chile was that, according to Spanish law, peninsulares were the only people allowed to hold the reins of government. Criollos could not. So criollos were literally growing up, learning from their parents how to run a country, and then not being allowed to do it. And so that's where this aristocratic revolution of José de San Martín, which liberated Chile and Argentina from Spanish control, where that started. By contrast, Peru and Bolivia were the centers of the historic Inca Empire. And so their population was significantly more indigenous than the population in Chile. In fact, if you only look at the populations of people of Amerindian descent, Bolivia today is over 80% native or mestizo, which is mixed between native and Spanish. And Peru is over 70% mixed, either indigenous or mestizo. And so that should give you a sense of the very different mentalities that these countries had, despite all being in Latin America. But what does this have to do with the Palestinians? So what ended up happening is that because Chile was run by criollos, they were more industrious because they had more exposure to how to build companies and corporations. And so they built companies in the Bolivian-held territory of Antofagasta, which you can see on the map there. Bolivia at this point actually controlled territory along the sea coast. And this territory was rich in nitrite, which was used to make fertilizer. And so Chilean companies began to build there, and a dispute arose between Chile and Bolivia concerning the taxes that Chile would pay to export the nitrate. And so Chile figured it was actually easier to just go to war with Bolivia and take the territory for its own than to pay the taxes. So now Chile was able to defeat Bolivia and Peru, because Peru was in secret alliance with Bolivia, and acquire this territory. But in order to make that territory Chilean, it needed to have more whites. Where were you going to get more whites? Well, Chile opened its doors to large-scale immigration from Europe. Now, they felt that because Bolivia and Peru were majority indigenous populations, having this white population meant that those whites would be more aligned to Chilean values. Jews and Palestinians sat in this weird area in the Chilean consciousness in the late 19th century of not quite being white, but certainly not being indigenous to Latin America. And therefore, their immigration, while not supported, wasn't checked. And so you had large numbers of Palestinians coming into Chile and acquiring land, starting up businesses with relative ease. And the vast majority of these Palestinians were Greek Orthodox. They were not Muslim at this point, which meant that they could integrate relatively well. In fact, most of them came from Bethlehem and its two suburbs, Beit Jala and Beit Suhur. These Palestinians in the first period were merchants and would often go back to Ottoman-controlled Palestine in order to bring goods from Chile and then bring those goods back to Chile. So if you remember that in 1923, those Ottoman passports stopped being useful. The Turkish government abolished those in the Treaty of Lausanne. So now you had these Palestinians who were living in Chile, having to completely retool their way of living because they could no longer go back. They were no longer Palestinian citizens. And if you remember, the requirement by the British to issue mandatory Palestinian citizenship to a Palestinian was that they had to habitually live in the region. These people were habitually living in Chile. They would come back to Palestine once in a while. So they lost their connection to the homeland that way. And instead, they decided to manifest it through the creation of agencies designed to promote Palestinian identity within the context of Chile. Now, at first, Palestinians in Chile, and still in many cases today, were identified as Turcos, Turks, because the Ottoman passports they carried were from the Turkish government, so they were clearly Turks. So give you a window into the understanding that Chileans had about the geopolitical situation in the Middle East. And in terms of what we have written, there was a lot of anti-Arab sentiment throughout Chile. Arguments that they were stinky, nasty, dirty, corrupt businessmen. In fact, ironically, many of the views that had circulated about Jews in Europe, had circulated about Jews in anti-Semitic corners, were now circulating about the Palestinians in Chile. And so Palestinians made an affirmative action to try and integrate themselves, but integrate themselves as a vocal Palestinian community. They made in the late 1800s the Club Deportivo Palestino, or this Palestinian sports club, which is still a major soccer team in Chile today. And they began moving into more political and economic sectors by the 1920s and 1930s. Probably the most famous Palestinian Chilean is José Salaquet Daher. José Salaquet is particularly famous because he was a leader in fighting against the Pinochet regime from a legal perspective. He was an absolutely phenomenal lawyer arguing human rights in the context of Chilean military dictatorship, and he was forced to leave the country because of threats on his life. He was also a huge part in the reconciliation after Pinochet was overthrown, helping to deal with the cases of the desaparecidos, the people who were disappeared, and other issues pertaining to that government in Chile. And so you have this 500,000 strong, roughly speaking, Palestinian community in Chile. In fact, it's the largest Palestinian community outside of the Middle East. Now, the Palestinian community in Chile is also very politically active. They support the Palestinian independence movement, and they support Chile having a very strained relationship, if that, with Israel. But that's not the only view that Palestinians have in the diaspora. You also have Palestinians like Najib Bukele, who is the current president of El Salvador. He is an ethnic Palestinian. In fact, his father is an imam. He is Christian by religion, but his view is very favorable to Israel. He's a right-wing populist within El Salvador, and he sees a relationship with Israel as clearly beneficial to the growth of El Salvador. And so the Palestinian identity is not something that he expresses or pushes forward in a very strong way. He pushes forward instead a Salvadorian identity and sees more in common with El Salvador's future in Israel than he does with the larger Palestinian cause. All right, and so that is my 2 hours. All right, so questions, comments, clarifications, please put those in the chat. I will read those and answer those questions in due course, but let me tell you while you're formulating those, some things about us and our organization. This is Middle Eastern Islamic History. We meet every Wednesday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. And next week, we will finish this episode on the Palestinians and their history. And after that, we are going to talk about the Arab republics of Egypt. I'll probably push that back a week because of how many more slides we have to go. But we also do Asian philosophy. Jason Peng does that on Saturdays. Aaron and I periodically do European Union security. Jane and John do Powerful Women in Dead Languages, respectively, once a month. And then, of course, we have our short-run series, like our series on the Russo-Ukrainian War. We're probably going to pick that up in around April or May when the war starts picking up again. And we are going to continue periodically with our Islam 101 series and Islamic City tours. And of course, we have our older series, all of which you can see on our YouTube page. All right, so I have a few questions. All right, so the first question I have is, how did Aramaic become extinct considering Jesus was from Nazareth? Okay, if we're talking about the longevity of the Aramaic language, it was first used by the Arameans, who were a population existing in what is now southwest Syria, the area around Damascus. The Arameans themselves were not politically powerful. They were individuals who were very well known for their mercantile ability. And so their language of Arabic became the dominant lingua franca simply by virtue of the fact that they were trading with everybody. And empires that ended up conquering areas of the Levant especially began to use Aramaic as their dominant language. We see this in Assyria, for example, and the Assyrian language, which was based on Sumerian, gives way to Aramaic around the time of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. We're talking about 700 BCE. And this is followed by the Neo-Babylonians, who also use it as an administrative language, and by the Persians, who also use it as an administrative language. Now, Aramaic continues in use, especially among the indigenous populations during the Hellenic period, right? The Alexander the Great conquers the Persian Empire. And during the Hellenic period, Greek begins to be introduced, but as I said, indigenous populations, especially in religious contexts like Jesus was using, were speaking Aramaic, especially when it came to their religious festivals, their use of the Bible, and so on and so forth. So Jesus would have been speaking Aramaic, but Greek began to eclipse Aramaic slowly but surely during the Byzantine imperial period. Once Arabic became the dominant lingua franca of the Umayyad Empire and Arabization began, Arabic became the dominant language, and Aramaic and Greek both lost out to Arabic. We don't know exactly when this stopped. When people stopped speaking Aramaic as a day-to-day language, with the exception of the Assyrian community, which is not in Palestine by and large. But we know that when the Crusaders entered, they didn't really discover many Aramaic-speaking populations. So that's sort of how it became extinct. But Aramaic as a language is actually not extinct per se. As I said, the Assyrians today still speak it. And the Assyrians are a minority population in eastern Syria, northern Iraq, southeastern Turkey, and northwestern Iran, a territory that roughly overlaps with the Kurdish region as well. And they speak 3 different dialects of Eastern Aramaic and 1 dialect of Western Aramaic. So those all still exist. There's also the Jewish population that speaks Aramaic called the Nashtidan, and they're from northwestern Iran. They now almost exclusively live in Israel. There's a question, does El Salvador import or export goods from Israel? Yes, they do both. Israel is a supplier of military equipment. No surprise there. That's one of Israel's primary exports. Israel also engages El Salvador with high-tech solutions, and El Salvador provides a number of raw materials to Israel. But the larger reason for Salvadorian affinity for Israel is the religious piety of Salvadorians. Most Salvadorians are either Roman Catholic or evangelical, and they believe that there is a strong religious reason to support Israel. In fact, support of Israel is decreasing primarily in Latin America as people become less religious. And I just have a comment that John Maloney will actually be talking about Aramaic at the beginning of April. So you only have to wait 1 month to hear an even more in-depth discussion of how Aramaic works and is organized. And I have a comment about the Jewish refugees from Muslim countries. So I'm going to read the comment and sort of react to it. Let's not forget ever that 850,000 Jews were expelled from Muslim countries with little more than the shirts on their backs. Their money and property were confiscated. Many were murdered. This happened upon the creation of Israel. The UN never helped those Jewish refugees. I know, I met those people in Israel. Let's start with the last part first. When UNRWA was created, it was not created specifically for the Palestinians. It was created for the refugees from the conflict, which included the Jewish refugees. That said, very early on, Israel made very clear that it was going to rehabilitate those communities, and it did not want UNRWA to intervene, primarily because if UNRWA intervened, there might be more international scrutiny on Israel's early decisions. Israel was very independence focused, which was a fair decision, but that's why Jewish refugees in Israel did not receive UNRWA assistance. And Israel was the only country within the 5 countries over which UNRWA had jurisdiction, at least initially, and still is today, where Jews went to. All the other countries, Syria, Jordan, Egypt, the West Bank, Gaza, these areas all lost Jews. Lebanon had some Jewish increases, but these were very few and were generally well integrated pretty quickly. As for the rest of the quote, I completely agree. 850,000 Jews, that's generally the correct estimate, between the years of 1949 and 1967 were expelled from the Muslim majority countries. Some of them left under incredible hardship. The Jews of Iraq, for example, 80% of them left between 1950 and 1952. And that's a population of 120,000 people out of a population of about 140,000, roughly. And they left with great haste and under a law that would deprive them of all of their property. So they literally had to give up everything except what would fit within a briefcase, get on a plane to Iran, which was an Israeli ally at the time, and fly from Iran to Tel Aviv. There were cases like Morocco where there was certainly some pressure. There was discrimination against Jews in the MENA, the Jewish quarters of the major Moroccan cities. But that did not rise to a national level. And in fact, during the Holocaust, it was not just the King of Denmark who said, I have no Jews in my country, I only have Danish citizens. The King of Morocco, Mohammed V, also said, there are no Jews in Morocco, there are only Moroccans. And Jews in Morocco, while there were certainly some who were killed in the Holocaust, in fact, we have recovered the ashes of Moroccan Jews in Europe. By and large, Moroccan Jews were spared most of the Holocaust. And there was generally a feeling of connection and rapprochement between the Muslims and Jews in Morocco. So the Jews that left generally left more for economic reasons or for social reasons than necessarily political reasons. Regardless, that 850,000 Jews, about 500,000 went to Israel, and another 350,000 went to France, the United Kingdom, United States, and Canada. And those populations have not received any support from UNHCR at any point. Those refugees have not been classified under any mechanism, but the state of Israel has taken care of them. And yeah, the commentator is making the point of the Farhud in Iraq, and the Farhud was one of the reasons in 1941 why Jews had to flee. Following that, there were the humiliations, such as the 49 executions of leading Jewish community leaders. Iraq was certainly a case where the Jews were expelled, and it is the worst case of Jews in the Arab world, with the possible exception of Yemen. So, yeah. Then there is a question of, from my perspective, purely subjectively, why have Google and National Geographic removed Palestine and Ramallah from its maps? I'm not sure of what's going on in particular. National Geographic is doing, so I can't really comment on that. I can say that I've seen, generally speaking, people are reticent to use the word Palestine to refer to the state of Palestine, that is the Palestinian territories in their entirety, as claimed by the Palestinians in their Declaration of Independence in 1988. But it could also be that there's some threat of people committing some sort of violence or otherwise, because of the controversy surrounding whether those things should be identified by the term Palestine, whether they should be identified as Palestinian territories, occupied territories, Judea, Samaria. There's a lot of different terms that are used for the West Bank in general. And so I think that that's part of the thought process there. Hi, Wayne, you wanted to add something?
Yeah. And, in Morocco and in other Muslim countries, some Jewish women were forcibly taken by Muslim men, forced to be their wife. And that was one of the reasons why many Jews left Morocco.
It's true, but it wasn't explicitly, not necessarily Jewish women. A lot of Muslim women, especially in the Hill tribe areas, were taken this way. There's a very common problem of bride stealing that also occurs in Central Asia. Tajikistan, for example, has a number of serious issues dealing with bride theft, where 3 or 4 men will literally run up to a house with a young woman, grab her, abduct her to the potential groom's house, and force her to marry him. This is a very huge issue, and so it's very common across less organized parts of Morocco. In the major cities like Rabat, it's less felt, but if you're in the smaller towns across the Atlas Mountains, that's certainly an issue.
We also want to talk about honor killing.
Yes, honor killing is certainly certainly something that exists in honor societies. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. Hi, Lex.
Hi, I don't really have a question. Honestly, I just want to say I really appreciated this. It was really informative. I really am glad I got to come. I really don't want to say nerd out about these kinds of things, but history is not something I'm personally good at. So I really appreciate your attention to detail and your expertise. I definitely am looking forward to the next session. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Lex. That's really nice.
Richard, I want to ask you something.
Sure.
Do you know all of this by heart, or are you reading it? Your depth of knowledge is fantastic.
Thank you for the compliment. The slides you see are my notes. So the various pictures I see those pictures and I remember what I want to say. That's what I do. I don't have written notes somewhere. I don't have a sheet that I'm looking at. I'm looking at the same slides you are.
So apparently you've been studying history for many years.
Informally.
I see. Wonderful. Just wonderful.
Thank you.
And, you know, I don't want anyone to ever think that the Jewish people in Israel are oppressing the Palestinians. In fact, now people are very, very nervous in Israel about what's going to happen. And I'm worried about it also. There's a terrible situation of random killings of Jews there.
In regards to the question about, you know, Israel's survival and the relationship with the Palestinians, I think it's very hard to look at the situation in the West Bank and say that there's not some degree of oppression going on there. There's certainly numerous different crimes that are occurring. Probably the clearest one is the straw widow, which is when Israeli soldiers will enter a Palestinian house and use that house as a military position and put the particular family either in some other area of their house or expel them from the house if they need it for a longer term. There are issues of expropriation of land. There are questions about there are a lot of different questions. I don't think some people will argue that it rises to the level of genocide. I don't think that it does. I don't think it fits the definition. But the point that I was going to make, and you'll see it next week, is that Israel's not unique in this, and the relationship between Israel and the Palestinians, if you followed any part of my series, is not unique in this. I have numerous episodes that go through how one population abused, mistreated, expelled, tortured, insert war crime here, another population. And if anything, this shows just how indigenous to the Middle East Israel actually is, which is a common argument by those who disagree with Israel's presence in the Middle East. They say that it's a Western settler colonialist entity. No, actually, Israel has integrated into the region quite well, and it's integrated into the region in its positive aspects in terms of its food and its culture of vivaciousness and its high demographic and its great demographics and all these kinds of things. And it's also integrated in some of its negative aspects, which is all the power playing between the different entities. And the relationship, I think, can actually be very strongly paralleled between the relationship between Syria and Lebanon, the relationship between Israel and Palestine. There was a question here about how Palestinian causes on campus can cause strife for Jewish students who speak their mind. I think that's absolutely true. I think in a lot of respects, Palestinian causes on campuses understand that the Palestinians are suffering, but they don't understand the ubiquity of it, that it's suffering that occurs in multiple different countries, and it's rooted in Palestinian statelessness. That's number one. Number two, because it's rooted in Palestinian statelessness, the Palestinian Authority actually has power to remedy some of that. And the Palestinian Authority also has the ability to negotiate certain things. It actually has a very close relationship with Israel, which means that it has a lot more leverage than a lot of people give it credit for.
Richard, I'd like to remind you of one thing. Are you aware of pay for slay?
Yes, I'm aware of that. And that's one
right.
thing that the Palestinian Authority could absolutely stop doing.
All right. And also, the holiest site in Judaism is on the Temple Mount.
Yes.
And Jews are prevented from praying there.
By Israeli law. By Israeli law. Yes. The Israeli government in 1967, when they took control of the Temple Mount in the Six-Day War, they decided to continue to have it under the authority of the Jordanian Waqf. They could have easily confiscated it. Jordan didn't have the power to enforce that. They chose to let it continue under the power of the Jordanian Waqf, and they issued decrees that it is forbidden for Jews to pray there, which is what it says down there. In fact, Israeli Arabs routinely go to go to the Temple Mount, to go to the mosques there, like Masjid al-Aqsa and the Haram al-Sharif, the Dome of the Rock. So there's no actual prevention for Israelis to go there, other than the agreements that Israel has decided to make for the maintenance of peace.
Yeah, for
Whatever
the
tenuous that
maintenance
is.
of peace. If it
Whatever
wasn't for
tenuous that
that,
is.
if it wasn't for that, Jews would gladly go there. Jews want to go there.
I think that there are certainly some in the Datei Leumi, the religious Zionist community, that want to assert Jewish power on the Temple Mount, but I don't see a wellspring of Jews who want to go there for the sake of praying in that location. In fact, most rabbinical sources actually argue that it is forbidden to go up there, specifically because we don't know exactly where the Holy of Holies is. And if we don't know where the Holy of Holies is, it means that impure people, because all people today don't have the expiation of sacrifices, which would be required under temple practice, they would be stepping in holy ground and therefore contaminating it. So that's the majority Jewish rabbinical decision. Now, the religious Zionist position is slightly different, because religious Zionism is a nationalistic reinterpretation of religion.
All right. And also, Israel does many kindness for many countries in distress.
Sure. Yeah, like for example, right now they're assisting the Turks and even the Syrians, despite the fact that Israel and Syria don't have relations. The Syrians reached out through international contacts to request Israeli assistance in response to the earthquake, and Israel's responding. So yes, I know, I completely agree. Israel does a lot of humanitarian things.
I know, I want people to know that, because there's too many bad things said about Israel, and it's very personal with me. I don't like to hear it. It's not true. So, all right.
On that note, I think that if there are no further questions, yeah, I think I'm just going to finish the answer I was giving earlier about Palestinians on campus. And so the thing is that they blame Israel for what's happening to the Palestinians, and Israel's certainly part of the mix, but Israel isn't the only thing in the mix. And the lack of criticality that these groups have with respect to other regimes and other forms of torture and abuse really shows that it's not a thorough investigation of human rights and human rights issues, but a paper-thin attempt to somehow claim that they have some kind of moral courage or some sort of moral validity when they really don't. Because if you actually have moral courage, you'll take that position on everything. I think, for example, a perfect example of this same kind of mentality, but at a higher level, is Noam Chomsky. For example, he has defended the Cambodian democide. He has defended the Bosnian genocide at Srebrenica and Jena, because he likes the people who were committing the genocides. So you have these sorts of thought processes, and it's very easy to fall into them, that if you like a certain group of people or you don't like a certain group of people, to assume the worst of them.
You know, one other thing, Richard, in Israel, Palestinians, they can start their own businesses. Some of them got very wealthy there. They really, I don't feel they're oppressed people at all.
There is a fundamental.
They're even in the Knesset.
There is a fundamental distinction between Palestinian citizens of Israel, Palestinians in the West Bank, Palestinians in Gaza, Palestinians who are Jordanian citizens, Palestinians who live in Jordan and who aren't Jordanian citizens, Palestinians who live in Syria, Syrian Palestinians who are now themselves double refugees in, let's say, Lebanon or Jordan, Palestinians in Jordan, Palestinians in Western countries, Palestinians in Latin America. All of these different groups of Palestinians have different issues. Some are better off than others. I even forgot Palestinians in the Gulf countries. So all of these are different groups, and the presentation, as I finish it next week, will sort of try to touch on a little bit of all those different groups and what they're going through and how they manifest their individual identity.
All right. And how about adding what the Jewish people are going through, because they're terrorized, they're constantly being murdered one by one in Israel by Palestinians.
There's definitely stuff that goes both ways. Anyway, I'm going to close this out. Thank you, everybody, for coming, and we'll meet again next week. All right. Bye.
Thank you. Laila Tov.
Laila tov.